and welcome to this training on using the Premack principle, also known as first then and grandma's law. So looking into what the Premack principle is, it's a principle that makes the opportunity to engage in a high probability behavior contingent on the occurrence of a low frequency behavior that will function as reinforcement for the low frequency behavior. Basically, the Premack principle occurs when a preferred activity is used as reinforcement for a non-preferred activity. So looking a little more into preferred and non-preferred activities, a less preferred activity is defined as one in which the individual is unlikely to choose to do on their own, therefore developing the term low probability behavior. A more preferred activity is an activity that the individual would likely choose to engage in on their own, a high probability behavior. So, looking into some research on the Premack principle, according to the National Standards Project, the Premack principle is one of the behavioral interventions among the 14 interventions considered established in the research. Therefore, this means there is a significant body of research that supports the use of these interventions. David Premack proposed a unique approach to reinforcement. For any pair of responses, the more probable one will reinforce the less probable one. On top of David Premack's initial research, Geiger built upon this with a study in the school. This study uses play as an application of Premack principle to the classroom. It shows that taking middle school and junior high school students to play on the playground can be a powerful and uncostly reinforcer of learning that could be used by teachers, especially substitute teachers. This reinforcer has been found to increase students' learning time on task and self-regulation while reducing time wasted on disciplining teenage students. So let's look at some real-world examples. So almost anyone can benefit from using the Premack principle in almost any setting. So for example, a child has a hard time collecting their things and getting their shoes on before leaving the house. If you know you're going to a place the child enjoys, such as a park or a certain store, then the child may be more likely to get their shoes on if they were told, first put on your shoes and then we will walk to the park. Other examples include, first put on your coat, then we will go to the party. First put away 5 toys, then you can have the bubbles. First do 5 math problems, and then you can use the iPad for 3 minutes. There are some pros and cons of using the Premack principle. So the first pro is it is very easy to implement. The second pro is it can be implemented with many individuals and in most settings. So this can include schools, day programs, daycares, with adults, with children, and most anyone. However, the con of the Premack principle is it can be confused with bribing. So let's look a little more into the Premack principle versus bribery. So bribery is not positive reinforcement. Bribery is when you give the individual something before the desirable behavior occurs in order to encourage them to engage in a specific behavior or complete an activity. So an example of bribery can be, an individual does not want to transition to the van during day program and he starts to tantrum. While the individual is screaming, the instructor says, first stop screaming and then I'll give you the front seat. The individual stops screaming and then gets the front seat. Now, as soon as the class starts to transition to the van, the individual starts to tantrum again in the parking lot. So this individual may have learned, if I start to tantrum, my instructor will give me the front seat. So looking into more examples of bribery versus reinforcement. So an example of bribery, or another example of bribery can be, a client is aggressing on you at the park, and you say, if you calm down and stop fighting, we can get ice cream. This is bribery because the challenging behavior is dictating their reward. So as the child is already engaging in the behavior, you say, if you calm down and stop fighting, they may learn in the future that if they engage in the behavior, they can get a preferred activity. An example of reinforcement is if you said to the client, "Today, when we play nicely with others at the park, we will go get ice cream." This is positive reinforcement because it is set up as a future event. The client has not engaged in the behavior. Now let's look into how to use the Premack principle. So step 1, identify the low preference activity or the non-preferred activity, and also identify the high preference activity. Step 2, present the contingency to the learner either verbally, with words, or with visuals. Step 3, wait for the learner to complete the low preference activity and continue to withhold access to the high preference activity until compliance or completion. Step 4, once the individual has completed the activity, grant access to the high preference activity once the low preference activity is completed. Now we're going to look into examples of using the Premack principle. So, example of a learner complying with instruction or demand. We have the antecedent as the staff states first bathroom, then video. Then the behavior, the client uses the bathroom. The consequence, the client has access to the video. An example of a learner not complying with an instruction or demand includes the antecedent, staff states first bathroom, then video. The behavior, the client states no and refuses the transition. And the consequence, staff waits and does not allow access to the video. When using the Premack principle, staff can avoid engaging in a power struggle or bargaining because the contingency is in effect whether the client engages in a low preference activity or not. In the example above, the client can go about their normal activities without gaining access to the video. However, once they use the bathroom, staff can then provide access to the video. This next slide is the fidelity checklist for the Premack principle. This is what a clinician may use this when working with the staff and a client. It outlines the steps of implementing the Premack principle to make sure it is implemented correctly and with fidelity. It outlines the same steps as the previous slide. Now we're going to get into some questions. So, question 1. The Premack principle occurs when a non-preferred activity is used as reinforcement for a non-preferred activity. A preferred activity is used as reinforcement for a non-preferred activity. A non-preferred activity is used as reinforcement for a preferred activity. And a preferred activity is not used as a non-preferred activity. I'll give you a moment to think about this. The answer to question 1 is B. The Premack principle occurs when a preferred activity is used as reinforcement for a non-preferred activity. Let's look at question 2. True or false? The Premack principle has been shown to only work well in schools. A, true. B, false. If you got B, you're right. The Premack principle, the answer to the question is false. The Premack principle can be used in almost any setting. It can be used in grocery stores, it can be used at the park, schools, day programs, and other locations. Let's look at question 3. What is the best example of using the Premack principle? A. First play your video games and then clean your room. B. If you don't listen, then you will be grounded. C. First clean your room and then you can play video games for 30 minutes. D. If you don't do the activity, then you can have a break. If you answered C, you're right. The best example of using the Premack principle is first clean your room, and then you can play video games for 30 minutes. So cleaning a room can be a low preference activity, while playing video games can be a high preference activity. Let's look at question 4. True or false? Bribery is when you give the individual something after the desirable behavior occurs in order to encourage them to engage in a specific behavior or complete an activity. A, true, B, false. And the correct answer to this is false, because bribery is when you give the individual something before the desirable behavior occurs. All right, let's look at our last question. What is step 4 of using the Premack principle? A, identifying the low preference activity. B, using a visual to present the contingency. C, access to the high preference activity once the low preference activity is completed. Or D, identifying the high preference activity. If you answered C, you're right. Step 4 of using the Premack principle is access to the high preference activity once the low preference activity is completed. Well, thank you so much for reviewing this training on the Premack principle. I hope you have a great